Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ælfric Homily Project as we are moving right along with the year on getting one of these done a month. And that is the goal for the year. I would like to go through all of these eventually, though I realize that will take uh, quite a bit of time. So um, today, I wanted to go over the Assumption of Mary from Ælfric's first series homily. There's one in a second series as well. And sorry on the delay, actually. This is not coming out as soon as I would have liked. In fact, the homily reading itself came out on Assumption, and I wanted it to come out the Sunday before. I was mostly, actually, the problem was I was having computer issues. This computer stopped working, and it took me a bit of time to get it fixed. And so I'm still on the same computer. I don't really I'm not really in a position to get a new one right now, but it's neither here nor there. I also shaved. That's not important. So, um, but but yeah, let's get right into this. This one might be a little shorter than some of the other ones. We'll see. So this is from series 1. Again, this is kind of focusing, and Ælfric really mentions both of these in a sense, actually, so that we have the idea of the Dormidian and the Assumption. And so the Dormidian is when Mary goes to sleep surrounded by the apostles before being taken into heaven. And then there's just the Assumption, which is assumed bodily into heaven right before death or right after. It's not quite clear. The traditions vary, as all of this is extra biblical. None of this stuff is in the Bible, right? And so, in a sense, this is more like one of the saints' lives, in a sense, but because it doesn't have much biblical stuff like scripture actually in the homily at all, though there is some. So I would say that the former now of this Dormidian, the sleep, right, Dormir, is prevailing in Eastern Christianity today, though both seem to have been around in medieval England, though Ælfric does call this the Assumption still. So the latter, though, this Assumption was strictly not Catholic dogma until 1950. So that's rather recent. I mean, it's been tradition for a long time, but has only relatively recent, last century, been made official Catholic dogma. So. Okay, so this is another one of the Lady Days. If you remember back in March, we went over the most important Lady Day, and that is a Lady Day in Harvest. Sorry, Lady Day in Lent. There's also another Lady Day in Harvest, and there is also another Lady Day closer to Christmas. So this is the first Lady Day in Harvest. The other one is September 8th. Again, this would be the season of harvest for the Anglo-Saxons. September 8th is the Nativity of Mary. This is also called Marymas, though I would say September 8th these days is more often called Marymas. But again, the other one, Marymas, or September 8th, is also called the Latter Lady Day. It's kind of confusing, so I think it's a little easier just to say it's the Assumption of Mary, to be completely honest, considering there's two in Harvest. So, as it is. So, yeah, just heads up there. August 15th is Assumption. September 8th is Nativity of Mary. They're both called Lady Day and Harvest. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to point out actually is an interesting homily that Ælfric is probably aware of. We'll get to that in a second. This is from the Bodleian Homilies, number 13, and this is a English translation of a pretty common belief in continental Christianity at the time, medieval Christianity, and that is on the Transitus Mariae, which is pretty much apocryphal, but it deals with this idea of Mary on the Assumption and what we're celebrating on it. So this, I didn't translate this mostly because either if you wanted to use it as homework, essentially translate this. It interestingly opens very similar to some of Ælfric's, right? People most beloved, right? Men belovedest. So hear now what here say on this in this book, in these books rather. So it's a very interesting narrative. I just don't have time to go over the whole thing. The Bodleian homilies have some interesting things. We'll actually probably go over another Bodleian homily, maybe more in depth next month. when we go over the Michaelmas homily is the plan. So, but here's how it opens, and I will link this down below. But this link here on the bottom of the page is where I think a good introduction to the homily. Also, that page. This is by Eleanor Parker, of course. She links to where you can read the whole homily if you would like. So, and I do think it is an interesting look at the homilies compared to, say, Ælfric's, which are much more concerned with orthodoxy, right? And Ælfric is also a bit more concerned with exegesis, as opposed to just, calling people to repent and be obedient and stuff. And he also is pretty strict on his sources. He doesn't always mention his sources, actually, but he is normally very strict on where he is pulling his stuff, and he wants the readers to know that he is pulling from reliable things, which is very, I can appreciate that, right? Because we're not sure where the person writing Bodleian homilies got this transitus Mariae, or if we can, for example, point to a Latin. We're not sure if that Latin is really anything that we should be relying on. So, one thing that is mentioned, though, in this Bodleian homily, this is actually, I can't remember exactly how far into it is, actually, but here's the line. It says, "Anda quath ura drikten tu thara arichan Marian lichoman. Ne forlata ich the navra min merigrot. Ne ich the navra ne forlata min erklanstan. Forthan the thu art sotlicha goddess temple." And then said our Lord of the Blessed Mary's body, "I will not leave you, my pearl. I will never leave you, my precious stone. For truly thou art the temple of God." This is a picture of the Arkenstone by, I think, Donato Giancola, from The Hobbit, of course. And it's the same word, actually. So Tolkien would have gotten Arkenstone from the Old English. Here you can actually see that it is Erklanstan, which I could have translated as Arkenstone. I think maybe our modern English speakers would have understood. Arkenstone kind of sounds like Archenstone, even though it's not the same. So, but Erklan, Erklan is actually a dissimilated version of Erknan, that in that first N becoming dissimilated from the second N into an L. Just the linguistic change there. And so it is an interesting word. It actually does have some cognates. I think the most common is probably in Old Norse. The Old Norse is probably actually a borrowing from the Old English, though. Which happens, I guess. So interesting that that Christ here is calling Mary his Arkenstone, essentially his precious stone. So Mary as God's Arkenstone, his prize jewel, essentially, in a sense of what I would say in modern English, in a sense, like it's not just a precious stone, it's not just a pearl. She is like the prized jewel, essentially, for God, which I think makes sense. It gets you that medieval sentiment of Mary, that the rising cult of Mary, which still holds over for lots of traditional Christians even today. So I just thought that was a fun thing to point out with that homily as well. Besides the fact that it's pretty apocryphal, it does mention something like this, and I think I like to make those connections when I can. So the thing I will say that seemingly is a response to this homily, or homilies like it, by Ælfric, is actually more. He's more open about it in his Series 2 homily. So this is just an excerpt from that. And I got it from this link up here. Maybe I'll try to link that as well down below in the description. But so, if we mara sejath bethisum simbrudaya, thona we on tham hargam bokum bradath, they thur godis dictus I seta waron, thona beo we tham the wall manum jelika, they be heure einum dicta, otha beswevnum, fella lasa yeset nisa ariton. Ac thae lafulan laurevas, Augustinus Hieronymus, Gregorius an Ierucher odra, thur heura wisdom, he to werpon, sin swatha, heat tha duolichan, probably bitch, either ye on Latin, ye on English, an he radath on ye rada men. Ye know, is lawful. That looks like a error there, actually. Sorry about that. Manum to radana to sejena that soth is. And fawa is stara mana the maya ala the harkan bitch. The thur goddess muth. Oda thur goddess gas edicta. Waron forfremer dicha. Thur smakan. Lata jehwa away the dwolichan lasunga. They thought on waran de voorweerde, ladath an rada ihwa, other Christa, thara harkan lara, they os to Gilvanan richa yuisath, if we he hiran wilath. So again, just a quick translation. If we say more of this feast day than we in the holy books read, that through God's deliberation or inspiration maybe we're set, then if we will be like these heretics who from their own imagination or from dreams many false traditions written, but the faithful teachers, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory, so again his sources, as opposed to this Bodleian homily on the Assumption, many others through their wisdom rejected them. These heretical books nevertheless exist both in Latin and in English, and ignorant people read them. It is enough for believing, and this ignorant people seems to go back to his preface, the very first reading we did way back in December about error in books. So it is enough for believing people to read and to say that which is true, and few are those people who can examine all the holy books which through God's mouth or through God's ghost were inspired, perfectly examined. Let everyone cast away the heretical deceits which leads the unwary to bad fate, and let everyone read or listen to the holy lore which directs us to the kingdom of heaven if we will hear it. So the reason I put bad fate here is, like, people have this idea of like, what is fate? Well, fate is just a result, right? That's your fate is just the results, right? So it's really just the events. So it even has a sense of modern English, but there's often when you have the idea of fatalism that things are like set in order, you cannot change them. They are predetermined in a sense. That is the idea that most people, I think, get when they attach to themselves to for weird, right here, which is for weird. So bad fate. It literally could probably be translated as destruction. Maybe like there'd be a good translation of it, though I think more literally it is bad for, as in not like before, but like bad, as we've seen this before, like for Brennan, which is for burn, right? So burn down completely. And that we have this idea that it's tied to fatalism, but in reality it seems to be tied to this idea of events. Like the events are the weird, right? It's just the past, right? That's really what it is, actually, because like if you look at the Norse cognate, for example, it's Earther, which is cognate with weird, and it's just past. That's what it means, right? And so they are the events, things that happen, right? Occurrences, right? And so like even a historian would be called a weird ritera, which is literally just a weird writer, so writer of things that have happened, right? And so like I don't think it often, sometimes it does definitely seem to have this idea of destiny or fate, but oftentimes I think it is a bit less abstract than that. So anyways, so we have Liuza's thoughts actually on this homily as well. So I think this is his opening thought. This homily is a cautious account of the death and Assumption of Mary, probably written to counter what Ælfric regarded as the erroneous accounts found in other collections, such as the Bodleian homilies. Interestingly, he bases much of his argument on probability and plausibility rather than authority, and ends with a pair of miracles of the Virgin. Again, he doesn't rely on a lot of scriptures here, indicating her power as an intercessor and protector. The homily is based highly selectively on a letter attributed to Jerome, but probably by Pascasius Radbertus, De Assumptione Sanctae Maria Virginis. He begins with a fairly close translation, but quickly moves to a looser paraphrase. For the miracles of the Virgin, at the end of the homily, sorry, I don't know all my spelling errors here, Ælfric probably drew on an anonymous Sertimen Sancti Martyris Mercuri and an anonymous Vita Basili. And then this also Leo's notes. He says, the warning, lest the false account against heterodox versions of the story, which might seem to apply to other homilies circulating in Ælfric's day, is in fact actually found in Ælfric's source. So even then, he is relying on these sources, but interestingly, it turns out his source actually has the same account that he is saying is bad. And so it is an interesting idea on sources here and on Christian belief. Like you see this kind of in like the Apocrypha today. A lot of that wouldn't be considered part of the Bible, depending on what sect you are of Christian. And Or something like the Gospel of Nicodemus is heavily included in medieval Bibles, right? But is not at all, right, in modern Bibles. So um, just an interesting idea of like there's a common like going back and forth between this stuff. So we do have Jerome in the Vulgate in Anglo-Saxon England. The reason I want to mostly mention this, because again, I wanted to keep this relatively short. There is the Vulgate Bible that the Catholic Church uses and relies on, even though the Catholic Church is not so heavily into their Latin as they used to be, is the Codex Amiatinus, which for a long time was actually believed to be Italian, but it actually was, it probably was based off Italian, um, earlier Italian versions of the Bible. But this Pandect is actually from England, and it was from Wearmouth Jarrow, where Bede was during the time of Bede, actually. And it is now in Italy and has been for over 1,000 years. But it was made in Anglo-Saxon England. And that Codex Amiatinus, I did a little video on my other channel. This is it here. I'll try to remember actually to like link it kind of in my video with the card up there on the top, and you can just click on it. This is the oldest complete Bible. Some interesting stuff about it. So we won't watch this video now, even though it's clean. But so anyways. Now I just wanted to touch a little bit on Ælfric's vocabulary. So Ælfric, we haven't really talked about this before actually, but he has a vocabulary that's actually really tied to a school of thought, right? A school of kind of standardizing stuff, right? This would have been mostly likely spearheaded by Athelwald, but the person who wrote the most from the Winchester school is Ælfric, of course, because he wrote the most in Old English, just generally speaking. So we have things like Ylāthung, which is church or congregation, and then we also have like Kidara, which actually shows up in this homily, which means martyr. Though I definitely would say that even in the early stuff, he seems to prefer martyr. I've read in some texts, say like in Godden's Ælfric's changing vocabulary, that it becomes less common the further you get into his like series, right? That it becomes martyr becomes more common. But I would, based off my reading, mostly being in the first series, Kithara doesn't show up really much at all, and I would say martyr is just much more common anyhow. So we do have words that are considered Ælfrician. We have Arplaten, Badernak, Nienda, only occur in Ælfric and Discursus, which we'll mention it for a second, mentioned here in a second. And then for a thorough study, though, there's actually a lot, right? And this study goes over what is Ælfrician, like pretty much it'll give you examples of words that only appear in Ælfric or words that mostly appear in Ælfric, for example. And so it is really thorough, very comprehensive. So I would like identifying, categorizing, exploring Ælfrician vocabulary using the Dictionary of Old English. It's a source of Old English and evoked by Almos van Balen. So highly recommend that. I mean, not the most like interesting of reads in some ways, but very informative to look at and to get an idea of what this Ælfrician vocabulary is. So, yes. Then I did want to mention, though, the Ralph Discourse homily, which he was actually the successor to Anselm of Canterbury in the See from 1114 to 1122. The homily was actually thought to be written by Anselm until 1927, so less than 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago. And so it actually survives in about 50 Latin manuscripts. I mean, I would say Anselm was much more of a popular figure than Ralph here is. So, though he actually gave this, and we found out in the text that he gave the sermon in French, wrote it down in Latin. Someone translated it into English for us, actually. And so in Cotton manuscript, we have Vespasian D14, folio 151, at least that's where it begins, from the 12th century. Some of the earliest Middle English, actually, though Treharn says, for example, it says consistent leveling of the dative and the preterite plural, in particular to the unstressed Ian, and right. So it's showing already some effective sound changes, but this is just an interesting. This is again kind of another homework thing if you want to look at it, because again it would be considered early Middle English, but the demarcation between Old and Middle English is not quite easy to make, even between like early Old English and late Old English. Besides maybe in like poetry is a little easier to see, but because I mean the Old English period lasted several hundred years, so and then most of the switch to Middle English is kind of arbitrary. We normally do it at like the Norman Conquest, but it's not like the languages one. all of a sudden. In fact, most of the French influence, for example, in English is not inserted in English until the 13th century, right? Which is considerably after the Norman conquest, which is about when you actually see the latest date from Middle English starts. Some people will say 1066. The latest would say is about 1200, and it's really about 1205, maybe ish, 1215, that all the French starts getting added into English, and that is after John lost Normandy, and so there's actually a bit of a reason there, I would say. But this is the first time that Mary is actually allegorized as a castle, or castle, which is a contemporary theological development at the time, and so for the first time attested in English. If you want to read a little bit more about this, you can check out The Life of English in the mid-12th century, Ralph Discourse Homily on the Virgin Mary by Eleanor Parker, and who describes this as Ælfrician, and we saw in the previous slide that whoever put this in English does seem to use some of the vocabulary that Ælfric did, and so maybe is either direct influence from Ælfric, who was going to be copied for several centuries after the end, or after the Norman conquest, and also maybe just from this Winchester school influence. So again, this is just an example. I don't want to translate this for you. I'll read it out for you real quick, and then if you want to take the time, I can't remember where I even got this, so I'll try to find a link again to the whole homily as well. This castel thara ura drichten in kon betaknith lichtvicha, that cinder licha un rama marin Maria Christus moder, for castor is eclipod sum he stippel. They bith mid wala betrimid, swathat either other bewereth, with unwinning ye winne. Thyssen castella is richa with medden, that cinder licha marin Maria, or Maria Christus moder. For heo was fast licha betrimid mid mina, on wames my hades on likhama, and on jethanka swaswa mid strangen, castel wala swathat hira naivra, nemikte, in lachen, ne likhamnich, garnissa, ne fortent wahira jethanka, non ye livid, Hamitha, and forthante might had, strang licha my, withstanden thara garnissa that heat in a bit thur that overswitten modinissa, ye lomen ye winth, that in fara, for than was admonissa, stipple on hira, and while they averseth, alle modinissa fram than math hada. Right. So to me, it looks a lot like Old English. I mean, if you can, one thing I will say that if your modern English is pretty good, and if you can get down Old English, I think most Middle English is actually going to look considerably easier. We'll go over another Middle English piece here in a second, which is one that I originally found rather difficult when I first looked at it some years ago, but now when I look at it, is much more comprehensible to me on a first read. All right. One thing I did want to touch on, and we're going to touch on this a little bit, a number of times here, is the rose and lily imagery that shows up in the homily. It's quite, I don't know, one of the stronger parts of the homily. I would say this is like when pretty much the Holy Ghost seems like he's like some medieval shop, and he is singing praise to Mary, essentially. That is what it seems like to me. And we get this particular image, right? Singing about Mary, but it also seems to be from Solomon's Song of Songs, right? Or it's often attributed to Solomon. But in fact, so here, what is what we have? So what is this that here ascends like the rising daybreak, as beautiful as the moon, as choice as the sun, as terrible as a steadfast army? I saw the beauteous one as a dove rising over the streaming stream, an ineffable odor steamed from her attire, and so, as in the springtide, rose blossoms and lilies surrounded her, which is from the homily itself, but compare it to Song of Songs 2:1, for example, if you want to go look that up. But also you can compare it to, say, Song of Songs 6:9 for the dove, and Song of Songs 4:11 for the scent idea, though the scent thing, we're going to look at it a little bit here in a second as well. So we have William of Shoreham, for example, from the early 14th century poem, Berichte Tokinga, Thou art the hell, of Juan Spellenda Daniel. Thou art Emmaus, the rich castel, thou resteth alla weary, in thee rested Emmanuel, of Juan Ispeketh Isaiah. So again, we have that castle imagery again, which would have the first time in English in Ralph Descartes that we already looked at. So by true meaning thou art the hill. I had to put it in the again here twice. Sorry, of which Daniel talked. I don't know why I didn't capitalize Daniel. Thou art Emmaus, the rich castle where rests all the weary, and thee rested Emmanuel, of whom spoke Isaiah. You can get an idea of this song from, again, another Clerk of Oxford blog post, and so that's where I got this as well. So another one, even another one. This one is more of a set in autumn or winter, but it still has this idea of the lily flower and rose. So nu drinketh rosa ad lilie floer, sorry, at willen bear that sweet savour. In sommer that sweet tide, en nu is ne queen, ne so stark, ne stoer. Ne no levdi so bricht in boer, dat der ne schaal beglide. Whoso wol flesh lust forgoen, aan heaven bliss abide. On Jesu is dochter on, that Therild was is seed. So Therild, we talked about this last time actually, about the thorough nostril. It's a thorough nostril, nose thorough, right? So pierced, to be thorough is to be pierced. Also to be like get your ears pierced, I guess would be thorough. And let's see. Yeah, Bower here, lady, still retaining this this V, I guess, in this case. And yeah, but it opens with the now shrinks the rose and lily flower. So I do have French influence, obviously, here, the flower, savor, stuff like that. But and stour, I believe that this does survive in modern English, but not a common word. So yeah, so just more of those imagery, more of the imagery in earlier English. So then we also have something that I thought this is a little different, not so much in the poetry side of things. Actually, it's Agadic, so it is a dealing with. We're really similar to how certain like Hebrew things are explained and extrapolated. So it is a description, and the fluidity is unmatched in Old English, according to Fulk and Kane. And also it is present in something like Vercelli, Homily 9, and similar eschatological and cosmological Irish sources. So we seemingly, this Anglo-Saxon tradition, which is not very strong, but comes from these. So you have gnomic stuff that is still seems very native to Anglo-Saxon Germanic verse, though there are stuff coming from Latin and Greek gnomic stuff. And this is one of the things that in particular is actually coming from the Irish. So again, so the thing we're going to look at excerpt here is Old English Dialogues of Solomon and Saturn. I believe it's actually the one in between Solomon Saturn 1 and Solomon Saturn 2. This is prose rather than poetry. And I'm looking at it from Daniel on Lazark's The Old English Dialogues of Solomon and Saturn. Okay, so Saturnus quath, ac hulich havod haveth se pater noster. So Saturn said, so what kind of head has the pater noster? So this has been a dialogue talking a lot about the pater noster. This is the one that mentions Lillies. So Solomon quath, pater noster haveth julden havod an silveren fax, an thar the alle earthen waters sien ye mended. With tham heaven licham watram open on ana adren, an hit sam licha ridden on jena alle midden jaar, midden jaar, mid allem his je schaftum him mer, under thas pater nosters faxa anum loca dria. Hier standen. Und his Achan Sindon, 12, Thusendum Sita Bertran, thona alles midden jaren eartha. Tha thechio se mid thara Bertestan Lydian blostmum, of braded on die Eichwirch blostman laaf hebben. En 12 Sunan und Eichwirch blostma hebben, 12 monan an und Arwirch mona. Sia Sindor dice 12,000 sida Berta thonach Eoa was ar abilis slayer. So the paternoster has a golden head and silver hair. Hair is fax, like shadow fax, means like shadow haired, like gray or silver haired. And and then even if all earth's waters be mixed with the heavenly waters above in one channel and began to rain together, and middle earth with all its creatures, it could stand dry under one lock of the paternoster's hair. And his eyes, so it's very, very big, and his eyes are 12,000 times brighter than all the orbs of middle earth, even if it were spread over with the brightest lily blossoms, and each blossom's leaf have 12 suns, and each blossom have 12 moons, and each moon be individually 12,000 times brighter than it was before Abel's murder. So very, very different than some of the other stuff. I mean, it part of the gnomic verse, and it fits, I think, well in. But there's just the imagery, like Kane folks said, the floridity of it, unmatched in Old English stuff. So, all right, and then also going back to the stench and how those are kind of treated in Old English sources. So we're gonna look real quick here at the panther, 74b. That is a noble scent, but also we have 43 to 44. After Thara Stebna, stench utkimith, Otham wongsteda, winsumra stam. So after that voice, a scent out comes from the plain, winsome emanations or steam, as you can see up above. I translated this like odor thing as steam in a sense, but the Old English, as part of the Old English Physiologus, you can look at it from Bruce Ross. Even here, he says stench or fragrance is most often used to depict emblems of spiritual triumph in Old English narratives. For example, the sweet-smelling plants and blossoms of the funeral pyre of the phoenix, a symbol like the panther of resurrection, are interpreted as being the words and labors that ensure the salvation of holy men. The narrative of Christ and Satan, likewise, the souls that appear before God carry fragrant plants that are characterized as God's word. Another striking example of the spiritualization of fragrance occurs in the saint's life Guthlach, when the saint arrives in heaven. Sweet fragrance and the music of angels fill the air. These tangible perceptions become a metaphor for the harmony of heaven itself. Hus ist stench on se sway, heavenlich chlefor on se harga song. How the fragrance and music, the heavenly harmony, and holy sun. Song, that must be good. Thus, the significatio of the panther portrays the resurrection in imagery of fragrance. That was sweet stench. Gritty on winsome beyond world Allah. That was a sweet fragrance, fresh and scented throughout the world. A quotation from St. Paul on the grace that God bestows upon the world is introduced here, and the poet conclusively asserts the quotation, that is Atala stench. That is a noble fragrance. It's a very closing of the thing. So the panther is kind of I think in modern English we would be maybe surprised. I know I was when I first heard about this years ago, that the panther is representative of Christ. In the Physiologus, you have like things like the whale as well, which would be more representative of Satan. And so it's just interesting because normally when I think of the panther, I'm thinking of like Conan the Barbarian or something, right? This pantherish fellow. This is how he'd be described. So, and I'm not thinking of a sweet stench and of Christ and his resurrection in particular. So, a very interesting, I think, comparison there. Physiologus, of course, coming from more of a Latin source. But all right, so then I just wanted to briefly mention Middle English Pearl, which would be from the Gawain poet Sir Gawain and the Green Knight here, based off the similarities in style and theme, and they're all found in one manuscript. But such writings are actually part of a West Midlands alliterative revival that is in part may owe some of the inspiration to Ælfric's alliteration. In fact, I should know, I've said this before actually, that he's got like a rhythmic prose is often how people put Ælfric's later alliteration. Someone like Nelson Garrigan would actually clarify that the alliteration itself is poetry. That it is Ælfric is writing poem. He's writing poems without meter though. So it is non-poetic or is non-metric poems. And that Ælfric is really actually, when he writes these homilies, that they are poems themselves. They're not divided into lines, but you kind of could actually with the alliteration. But most Old English poems aren't divided into line anyways. I think we've only looked at one Old English poem in manuscript. Was that The Dream of the Rood, I think? And so you can see that in the manuscripts are not divided into these lines anyways. And so I wanted to read stanza 4 for you real quick. This is actually the page. It's the second page in the manuscript. It's right here. This is stanza 4 going down. I can't remember. Yeah. Okay. So we have it here in the Middle English, which again has this alliterative idea, which you get something like reference in, say, like the Canterbury Tales. I think it's the Parson's Tale, where it room rum ram ruff, or whatever, right? The alliteration of that is characterized of more northern England and not in London at the time. So, okay, so to that spot that I in specie expoon, I entered in that Arbor Green, so Arbor Green, in August in high season. Green corn is corn with crick cane, and hule their pearl, it trembled down, shadowed his worte for 3 I lovre, gingura and grom lune, and peonies powdered I between. If hit wat, semely on to sein, a fair flower, yet fro hit float. There one is that worldly, I wot and when, my precious pearl without in sport. So, my reading of this, I'm not used to alliterating middle English verse, to be completely honest. Most of it doesn't alliterate. So, I was just going to read Tolkien's translation of this stanza 4, actually, real quick. So, the spot whereof I speak I found when I entered in that garden green, as August seasons high came round, when corn is cut with sickles keen. There, where that pearl rolled down, a mound with herbs was shadowed fair and sheen, with gillyflower, ginger, and gromwell crowned, and peonies powdered all between. If sweet was all that there was seen, fair too a fragrance flowed, I wot, where dwells the dearest, as I ween, my precious pearl, without a spot. So I think that just gets across some of the poetry of it. Pearl has the reason I want to share that one is because it has that imagery of August. In particular, it does have this idea of imagery of the Assumption, as it gets into some stuff that you could easily compare to Assumption imagery of the Virgin Mary, of Pearl, even of her being without spot. It is a very heartfelt poem. It's very heartbreaking even at times. So this is the very beginning. It's considerably longer than this. So I recommend reading it if you have not. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the words. We're kind of winding down here, getting away from other texts and from more cultural things. And so one thing we have is sakerd, which is mentioned at the very beginning. Let's see. Yeah, very first sentence. Hieronymus se harker sakerd arat. So Jerome, the holy priest, wrote. So it is from Latin sacerdos. We also have, as we saw in the preface that I shared again back in December, that preost, mass of preost, mass priest, Latin says, or that Ælfric says, is from Latin presbyter, from ancient Greek presbyteros, and which I think has like an elder sense. I'm not entirely sure. There is another English word that probably wasn't used much, if I were to guess, but maybe was some. That is gida, which is cognate to Old Norse godi, godar, and the Gothic gudia. And this actually survives in a name. I think it's like a Latinized version of an English name, and so someone's name was Gida, and that name would mean priest. And so I mean, you have words for like this for goddess as well, like in like Gideon, right? You don't have the S ending, which is later, but yeah, Gida again. So it has the asterisk here because it doesn't survive really as a word for priest. But it easily could have been one. So, anyways, which is essentially kind of like a godder. Essentially, is kind of what it means, like a god, or kind of like Guthia, right? Is what it essentially means in Gothic here. So, in Old Norse, the Gothar become more associated with. So they're a little confusing pre-Christian, but in Iceland, that is like essentially what these chieftains, in a sense, are. They're chieftains and they're Gothar, right? And then they don't quite have, but they retain the name, but they don't have that like spiritual sense to them so much after conversion. So. All right, then we have also early on in the homily, we have bearer, Mother Theotokos. We have the holy cleric Jerome wrote a letter concerning the Assumption of the Blessed Mary Theotokos to a certain holy maiden named Eustochium and her mother Paula, who was a holy widow. And so this is translated by Chase Hakama, actually. If you go to his, I think, Alfred's World, I can't remember. I'll try to link that down below as well. So Canestra is literally, could be easily translated as mother, as bearer. So, I mean, you can see, we've seen the word similar before, right? To be born, right? To be begotten. So we have this idea, though, of honor thy father and thy mother, um, and which is in John 8:45 is kind of the response to that. Oh, I will say real quick, actually, that the reason I put Hakima's translation here is because I like how he used his Theotokos, which means like God bearer. So the Blessed Mary, mother to a certain holy maiden. Assumption of the Blessed Mary, Theotokos, right? So the mother of God, right, essentially. And so Theotokos is a title, actually, I believe, used for her as well, maybe in Eastern Christianity. So then we have John 8:49. Anhof Jesus, ik unhulthon, ich haba, axwera atan menana, ja jus unswereth mik. So, which is, answer Jesus, I have not a devil, essentially, but I honor mine, yet you dishonor me, essentially. So, I honor my father. Sorry, is Atan right here. So, Unhothon, interestingly though, is actually the feminine here, like a she devil, literally, and more common than the masculine Uhultha, which is cognate with Old English Unholda, by the way, though it translates a Greek neuter daimonian here because the Gothic is getting more from the Greek than in English. We're getting more from the Latin. So, but and then you get this interesting illumination here of Jesus holding Mary or holding her spirit, kind of in the reversal of like the Madonna and Child, which you do see in some medieval works. So some interesting imagery there, I think, and also just looking at the Gothic, I think helps a little bit with. You can kind of see how it's related to Old English. So ak is in Old English, havas, have as well, and Jesus here. Though they use the word Jesus, which Jesus doesn't show up all that much. Actually, we normally have him called like the Highland or something. So, yeah. Okay, so then we have the idea of perfect, which I think I may have talked about this before, but just real quick, I wanted to briefly go over it again. And that is that we have full framed is the Old English word for perfect. Which is full framed, literally in modern English. So completed, accomplished, or carried out, right? Fully accomplished, fully completed, fully carried out. So the Latin perfect actually has the same sense as where perfectus, right? Which means finished or executed or completed, though we don't tend to think of this in modern English, which is why I pointed out that often we think of perfect. We're not thinking of just like complete, like you have time to finish, essentially, right now, essentially, right? So, but you have something like Matthew 5:48, which some would maybe say like be therefore perfect eventually, all right? But like that, essentially that's already there, right? Because that's what perfect means, essentially. So, sieth nu jus frutoia. So again, this is the perfect. This is full fremit. It's not quite. It's full. Like it'd be like full tawian, I think, in Old English. But would be the verb at least. So swaswe ata iswar sein himanam frutoius ist. So even as your Father is in heaven, the heavens rather perfect is. So again, from the Gothic Bible. So let's get into some words of note. We have Walstud, which is interpreter or translator. The second element is not quite known from what I was able to find. Actually makes its way into Welsh, interestingly, even though this is strictly an English word. But seemingly what's interesting about it is that the first part seems to be Welsh. Walsh, right, is Welsh, not English. Welsh, right, walnut. Other things like that. But it's just interesting that we're not exactly sure, but it seems to maybe come from this early idea that there are Britons that are translating, right? They speak English and they speak Brittonic, right, or Welsh, and so that they would be translators, they'd be interpreters, translators, and so obviously Jerome would not be speaking Welsh, but the word is still sticking around for interpreter or translator. They have Ledenwarum and Hilvunwarum, so this actually leans literally Latin or heaven inhabitants, but it's the wada is the ending in modern English, so like a New Yorker, a Londoner, a London wada, right? So the Kantwada, for example, is Canterbury, or Kent people rather, a common Judish suffix, not really surviving in so much in like Saxon and English places. So. And then we have mostly in Kent. Then. So bibliothekon, which is a library, or bibliothekon, a collection of books or a library or a collection of books in one volume, literally the Bible, which is where we get the word Bible. And we have a shoal, which is troop or host, multitude, but it is modern English shoal. And we have Dana, which is a valley, or modern English Dean. Though I've never seen that one before. Though I think it's still using maybe some Northumbrian dialects, and it is particular like a stream and the little steep valley around it anyway. So, and then the Arkod, which is modern English yarked, to prepare or to make ready, yarkian, or yarkian. And then you have yurera or yurla, which means garment. This one is just a little difficult for me to parse, so I just thought I'd put it in here if anyone else is having difficulty. We have continuing, we have sarn, which is literally soreness, but it just means more of like pain, affliction, or woe. We have Bodl, which is, there is a modern sense of this that it would be bottle probably, but it means house or dwelling. It is not related to the word bottle, like a water bottle. So we have est, which is consent, grace, kindness, or pleasure. It is one of the words for grace, but it does have not quite the same meanings as say like r, or eva, which is like gift, right? And r is like honor, kind of. And those words are used for grace. So there's a lot of words for grace. I think we went over this probably in one of the first lectures. So then we have hoya hogu, which is care or anxiety. We have manradana, which is homage or allegiance, or mandrid, really, or manrid, modern English service, tribute, stuff like that. We have gars, which is grass, which is actually more commonly in Old English as gras, but is often metastasized as R's are liquids, and they just kind of move around. I think for example, the Old Frisian, when we went over the creation of Adam in Old Frisian, it's gersa rather than gersa. So, anyways, we have fordwinnen, which is to disappear, and we have need tharfness, which is necessity. So then we're really close to being done now, folks. But I wanted to go over a couple more of these specifically. Then we'll look at a manuscript very briefly. Again, we're going to look at a homily. Next time, I would like to look maybe not quite at Ælfric's homily for the manuscript. I think it makes the most sense to a degree to look at the actual text that maybe you already translated yourself, but also just to do some just different manuscript studies, especially since some manuscripts are a little bit more difficult to read in some ways. In fact, the Middle English ones, for example, I find a little bit more difficult than, say, some of the Old English ones. Not necessarily always. So we have Kempa, though, which is something that does come up. And so this means fighter. It is where the name Kemp comes from, modern English Kemp, last name. It is related to the word champion as well, and the source of the Old Norse word Kempa, which can mean giant, hero, or warrior. It is actually ultimately from the Latin word campus, which is where the word campaign would be coming from. Also champagne and champagne, depending on how you spell those, A-G-N-E, like the drink in the region of France, or A-I-G-N, which is much less common, but there's like a region in Illinois called Champaign, for example, and that can kind of mean like field as well. So cognate with champion, which entered Middle English from Old French champion, from medieval Latin campio, from Frankish campio, from the Proto-Western Germanic, essentially the same, so campio. And then from the verb, though, of campion, from Proto-Germanic camp, which comes from Latin campus. So champion, again, related, comes from that same Latin source. And then Old Norse has copy or kop. We have zeal. There's also comp, which, again, you can see that pre-assimilated cop, that and become another P. It's also from the Latin compass, for example. And then we have an example of an Old Norse text. I don't put Old Norse texts in here all that often because, admittedly, my pronunciation of Old Norse is not something I'm super comfortable with, though I'm studying it now to get more comfortable with it. So maybe we'll start seeing more Old Norse in these lectures. So we have Herbirjar uppsohu inspruda parsavals ridera. Var ein, maybe. It depends. Your V's in Old Norse are, by the time they're being written down in like Icelandic sources, they would have been a V. In the Viking Age, especially when you're reading like a Viking Age text, I think a lot of it, a poem maybe from the Viking Age, right? It makes sense actually to use a W. That is the earlier sound. So var ein, this is later, so it's probably fine to say var. Var ein of artis corpum. Okay, so here begins the story of Sir Percival, who's one of my favorite guys I like to read. If you watch my Liam's Lyceum stuff, I've done several videos on Percival. And who is a knight, or literally a writer, right? Who yet was one of Arthur's champions. So corpum, right? So we can see that word again. it is related to champion and to kemp and to kempa here in Old English. So, anyways, this is Percival down here on the left with his javelot. Anyways, and so then real briefly, we'll just go over Atewan and Atewan. We have to appear is really more of a Atewan, seems preferred in some texts for this intransitive meaning. We have to show or reveal for Atewan, which seems preferred for a transitive, right? So essentially are the same word, right? But in an intransitive sense, appear makes more sense. And in a transitive sense, show or reveal makes more sense in modern English, at least. That's how we distinguish them. And then the only technical difference really then is that I mutation present in the latter, Atewan, but really not present or unimutated on Atewan for some reason. And just wanted to point it out because I think Atewan does show up, and yes, it does. On sale, Birion is Atewid, open and empty. So, and the tomb is visible or appeared, open and empty. So, which is again the intransitive sense, and so it has the unimutated sense at the top there. So you just get an example of that. If you're reading other texts, maybe you'll get the transitive sense where it does have the mutation. So, all right, so let's get into the codicology. Let me stop sharing my screen, and then I will share my other screen. And hopefully it's saved. But if not, I marked what page you're going to find it on, and that is 96 verso, the folium there. That's what the F stands for. So here we are. I'll link this down below, as always, though I don't think the link will tell you which folium it is. So the link, my description of it will just put 96V. You can scroll down to 96V yourself. So anyways, let us compare this to the Old English we have from Lyosa in this case. Okay. Let's see. Is this? Let's see. Okay, I realized that I actually had clicked on the wrong link, and I had been sharing the previous Swithin's Saints Live manuscript as well. So this is the correct one. I will correct that and put the link below. This is one of the manuscripts we've gone down back to before. And so let us compare. This is again Bodleian 343, which again we've looked at before. So, but we have not looked at it for assumption. So let us begin and see. We have this nice beginning here, this incipit, and we do have a title, which is a little difficult to read, but Assumptio Sancta Maria. So not the Assumptio Sanctae Mariae Virginis as that Lyosa uses as his source. So Hieronymus Teharga Sacer, again the long S, Achrat, rather than Achrat, so just Achrat. There's a difference already. And it also has the Harka Sacer rather than Se Harka, so SE. So not Achrat, again, and then Ana, Pistol, Befort, Sita, sorry. Thara rather than Thara, so it's an A rather than Ash. Adia rather than Adigan. Maria rather than Marian. Okay, so we have changed some of our endings. Goddess Kenistran, which is, it has become an Ash, and it was an A originally, Kenistran. Let's see, to summa, so rather than summum, so we lost that dative plural. Harga rather than hargan. Madena. Hira is an I rather than a Y. Again, it wouldn't really matter in Middle English, I guess. It didn't really matter so much in Late Old English for that matter. So Noma rather than Nama. So again, getting Middle English stuff in here. Was. Eustochium. So we got a superscript for the M on the end, but Eustochium. And we get the Turonian et. To. Hira motor. So again, another I without instead of a Y. Right? And it's motor rather than matter as well. Let's see. Paula. Theo rather than Seo. Was. Ihargod rather than Ihargod. So again, already the became an E. Ihargod. Widowa. So we do have a Y in this case still, but widowa. Toll, thieves, I, thisum, yeah, okay, I instead of a Y, thisum twam, let's see, what does this say? Wimona? Is it the woman rather than weefmanum? So the F has already been lost in this case. There's definitely no F in there for wife, man, with weefmanum. Grat rather than arat again. They rather than se again. Irka rather than irka. There's an A in the text, Y over here as well. Hieronymus monifalda rather than minifalda, so the E here in the text I looked at. Tratbech. Forthan. Don't normally see the superscript for an N, but it is technically standing for a nasal there at the end. So it works. Thehi is the original text, so Theheo. Huaron. Let's see. Halias. Lives. Men. And Svitha. That's the first page. Should we look at it a little bit more? I guess I have a little bit more time. My hands are a little short on time today, so we shall keep on going for just another minute since this is a little shorter than normal. What we got here? Kinord, Lachenda, Kinord, Lachenda. So it doesn't have the on the front as a prefix as it does in the Old English. On Boch Licha rather than Boch Lichem. Again, so the loss of that dative plural ending. Smachunga. So again, dative plural, not there, smachunga. So it was. So this doesn't really look like a thorn, but I'm not sure what's going on there. So this Hieronymus was Hali Preost. Okay, so soccer is not here. Interesting. Wasn't there soccer on the previous page though? Yeah, soccer here. I guess it's been replaced with Preost here, which is not the case in the Old English. And Itogen rather than Itogen. See. On Hebrishum. So you do have the UN still there. Speech pretty much rather than Yechreolda, which is in the Old English. And on Grekische. It looks like an S. Grekische. Not quite the Grekische is what I would expect. Grekische. Anyways. And on Ledena rather than Ledenum again, so lots of that data. Plural again for Fremadlicha rather than Medlicha. And He Winda, so we do have to retain the A here rather than Arat. Ura Bibliothekan of Ebresh. So you do have the H here, but you lose the H here. Ebresh. Brescia? Here's interesting. So you lost the H there. Where were we? Oh my. Oh, Bochum, Toledana, Spatcha. Let's see. It has an on here, which is not in my tags. On he is. Then they rather than say. Firmista rather than firmista. Wal stored rather than war stored. So there's no H here. That's what you'd expect in Old English. Betwixt rather than betwixt. You do have the H again. Ebration, and Grecum. So that is right, the Greek. Okay, interesting. And Ledin War. no superscript, but you do have the beautiful. So I guess probably I could stop now, but I want to at least do this next line. This is fun. Anyway, so toi and hund seovunti, so the prefix hund, um, boca rather than boca, see thara rather than thara, so it's an a rather than ash, alda rather than aldan, so it is still rather than lahu, something like that. So and then on thara again, a over ash. Niran rather than an A again. Ash over A. Che arvinda on leden andra bibliotecan. And again, the superscript for in this time. All right, we shall stop there. If you want to continue Bouton over here. Bouton odra rather than odra. Okay, anyways, I'm enjoying this. I think the manuscripts are fun to read. Again, if you want a good introduction, I would say, to manuscripts, which again are obviously broadly medieval anyways, I could recommend Introduction to Manuscript Studies by Clemens and Timothy Graham. Though I do think just finding the manuscripts themselves and reading them, something like this is fun because while Ælfric is writing in late West Saxon, this manuscript is obviously from a later time period, and so in Middle English entirely, and well, just an early version of it, and so it's nice to see the changes because they're rather relatively small, and I'm not like studying it as so much into why, but just to see them and see that language change in the process. So, which already is kind of there. I mean, like, remember, one of the things I wanted to get right with my Old English recitations is that I want to get my pronunciation better, and my pronunciation definitely needs some work still, and I apologize about that, especially with my stress initially on that first syllable, unless it's like prefix like e or something like that, or and also just some things I realized that I like mess up after the fact. For example, like my G's after an N should definitely be a J, and I just kind of forget sometimes that it's not just CG that make the J sound; it's the NG also make the J sound often, and so it's just stuff like that. I forget, and sometimes maybe I miss say my G or my C's as well, which are one of the more difficult things, I guess. So, also I have a tendency to make the ash an I rather than ah, like a long ash be an I rather than just for a short ash. But so anyways, I'm working on it. Hopefully continually improving. But anyways, thank you for watching. Hopefully this is informative. Hopefully this stuff down below is useful. If you want to do some of the translation practice I have here, just pause and do it. I'll try to link down the stuff that is useful as well for you. And so thank you for watching. Next month again, hopefully I will be doing Michaelmas, and we shall look at some fun stuff, hopefully. So I need to get working on that. It's more than a month away, but I have been kind of restricted, and I am gotten busier somehow. And so hopefully nothing else breaks, which would definitely hurt my time even more. So, but I do enjoy doing these, and I appreciate anyone who sticks around. So thanks for watching.